Hello and welcome. Today we will start talking about Russian history and I will give you a very quick overview. Now, if you're watching this video on YouTube, I want to mention that I will sometimes skip over some important historical events or maybe even periods of time. First of all, it's hard to go into all important events in the framework of an overview that's supposed to cover everything in kind of like broad strokes. But the second reason is because I use this series of videos as kind of like an introductory lecture for my other courses that I teach at my university. So what I included in this overview are historical events that connect to or explain some of the historical developments later in Russian history or even in Russia today. And I reference these events later in my courses, and that's why I felt like it's important to create this overview lecture for my students to give them kind of like a heads up about what's coming. And at some point, I will add probably all my lectures to YouTube, so stay tuned. Okay, let's start. Now, we're going to start at the very beginning and spend a little bit of time looking at Russia before it was actually Russia. Now, as you can see on this map, before the 9th century, there were different Slavic tribes settling all across this area of Europe. And of course, most settlements back then appeared along rivers because at that time, rivers were basically the roads used for trade and for travel. Now, as you can see, there were there's quite a number of Slavic tribes on this map. And of course, there was also a lot of mixing within Slavic tribes and also between Slavic and non-Slavic people. And at this stage, however, we still can roughly associate certain territories with specific tribes, and that's basically how historians describe the region at the time. But it's important to understand that at this point, we still cannot really talk about a Russian state or a Russian statehood because nothing is established yet. So when we talk about the origins of the Russian state and statehood, there are several theories. And since we're looking at events that happened such a long time ago, historians cannot be completely certain about everything. Still, the most widely accepted theory about the beginning of the Russian state is the Norman theory. And according to this theory, the Slavic tribes invited a non-Slavic person to rule over them. And that was a Viking or a Varangian named Rurik. Now, historians still debate exactly how and why or where this happened, but the mainstream view is that it probably did happen. So the idea is that Slavic tribes invited Rurik and his warriors to establish some kind of a governing structure for them, as well as provide them with military protection. Now, there is an explanation, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And the explanation is that many of the Slavic tribes were primarily farming communities, and they wanted stability and protection from raids by nomadic groups. And again, at that time, those kind of raids were pretty common. And also they wanted some kind of a protection from internal fighting between the tribes or between, leaders within the tribe. So instead of becoming warriors themselves, especially to protect themselves from kind of like external raids against them, they invited people who already had military experience and were already some kind of an organizing fighting force. And Vikings or some Scandinavian tribes at this time often worked as mercenaries, military mercenaries in different regions. So this arrangement would actually have made sense historically. So according to the Norman theory, the people of Novgorod, and that was one of the major centers of the region at the time, invited Rurik and his brothers and his people to rule over them. And of course, we cannot really use the word capital in the modern sense here, but we kind of could say that Novgorod was the capital of the area at this time because it was one of the major political and economic centers. Now, I don't really have a separate course in Russian art yet, but I like including examples of Russian paintings in my lectures whenever I can. So let me pull up a painting here. So here you can see a famous painting by the Russian artist Viktor Vasnetsov, and the painting is called The Invitation of the Varangians. Now, the painting was created in the late 19th century, so of course it's not a historical document by itself, but it's kind of like a historical interpretation through art. So in this painting, you can see Rurik and his brothers, and also people of the Novgorod region or the settlement of Staraya Ladega. As I said, the information in sources differs where it happened. And you can see that the Vikings are depicted as warriors, while the Slavic people look more like ordinary villagers and farmers. Okay, let me go back. And another thing I want to mention is it's also interesting that historians do not fully agree on where the name Rus or Russia comes from. So one theory connects it to the Varangian tribe called the Rus, so that Rurik was part of that tribe. Now, the theory that I personally like is the theory that connects the word Rus to rowing, like athletic activity. Because I mentioned that how important rivers were at this time, and of course the Varangians traveled extensively by river. So some historians believe that people in Southern Europe may have heard that word Rus connected to rowing, like Rus, 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 row, 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 and basically gradually began using this word to describe these people from the north. And so that's one possible explanation, I just like it, for how the name spread. But it doesn't matter really how it started. Eventually, the territory began to be known as the land of the Rus, and later Russia. And okay, it's definitely important how it started, but it's not important for this specific historical overview. Okay, so according to the traditional account and the Norman theory, Rurik settled in Novgorod while his brothers ruled neighboring territories. And this arrangement basically helped establish a more defined structure. We might call it a more defined political structure in the region. And it also started the first Russian dynasty, the Rurik dynasty. And the Rurik dynasty lasted for several centuries, much longer than the Romanov dynasty that is usually more known in the West. Okay, so according to the Norman theory, Rurik and his family began ruling over these territories, and as the state expanded, the territory of Rus grew larger and was getting more organized. So we can start talking about statehood at this point in time. Now, later Rurik's descendants moved the political center from Novgorod to Kiev, and this marked the beginning of what we usually call Kievan Rus, with Kiev as its center. And of course, at that point, they were not using this term. This term was applied to this period of time later, but this is an important part of the Russian history. Now, the decision to move the capital from Novgorod to Kiev made sense because much of the trade was happening in the south, connecting Slavic people to Europe and to Byzantine. So Kiev was a more practical location for trade and for political connections. Another important thing I want to mention that this lecture, this series of lectures focuses on major historical events. And usually when we look at history, describe history, we look at major events that were happening. But for this overview and for my lectures, it's equally important to think about the lives of common people. So as the lecture continues, you will see why this matters so much in Russian history for the development of the Russian national mindset, why it's so important to look at the common people. Now, you will see this little image at the bottom of the slide, kind of like showing common people, and it will appear through multiple slides on this lecture. So here is where I ask my students in class, when major historical events are happening, what is life actually like for ordinary people? Is their life good? Are they happy? And of course, we all have kind of like our own understanding of what a good life is or what a happy life means. But for this historical overview, I ask my students to think about quality of life in terms of freedom and personal liberties. Can people travel freely? Can they speak their mind freely? Do they have control over their own lives? These are important questions because it's impossible to think about a good life or a happy life without at least some degree of freedom. I think you'd agree. Now, at this early stage, life for common people was actually relatively free. peasants or farmers could work the land, move to different places if they wanted to, or they could remain where they were. So compared to later periods of Russian history, that was a fairly flexible and free way of life for the common people. And at this point, the Slavic people lived in relatively free communal societies, so in communities, and their main activities included agriculture, hunting, and beekeeping. Beekeeping has traditionally been very important for the Russian culture. Okay, we actually will stop here, trying to keep my videos short. And in the next video, we will talk about another probably the first very important event in the Russian history, and that's the Christianization of Rus. Thank you.
If you like it, please click like.